Welcome again to the National Museum of the United States Army's monthly book talk. I'm John Moss. I am going to be the host tonight for our author, Michael Laramie, who has written a very good book on Queen Anne's War, which I finished in August. So I'm waiting for the next one to come out. I also read his previous book, King William's War, which was also very good, and that was the one that was the reason we invited him to give a presentation on his new book. Michael is with us tonight from Arizona, and he is, as I mentioned, the author of the previous work on colonial conflicts, King William's War, and he has a forthcoming title on another colonial war, King George's War. He's almost out of wars prior to the Revolution, so we'll have to see what he does after that. But Michael, a good evening to you, and I'm going to turn it over to you. And we're looking forward to hearing all about this early American conflict.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to talk tonight about Queen Anne's War, specifically Queen Anne's War in the Northern Theater. All right. So a little bit about me. I've written 6 books. Those are on the right-hand side. I have another one coming out next year, Gunboat, Muskets, and Torpedoes, about coastal South Carolina. And as John was mentioning, I'm currently working on King George's War. I'm originally born in New Hampshire, raised in Vermont, flew with Air Force reconnaissance units out of England and Greece during the Cold War, and found myself in Tucson. And today I'm the Director of Engineering and Anode Development for a Beyond Lithium Ion battery company here in Tucson, where my colleagues and I have developed Glycerion technology for aerospace and EV technology. With that, quick overview of the talk. I'll speak about King William's War for a few slides. I'll talk about the 5-year peace between King William's War and Queen Anne's War. Then we'll talk about the first part of Queen Anne's War in the Northern Theater. Then the second part, and the reason it's broken into 2 parts, is there's a year-long truce. And then we'll wrap up the conclusion of Queen Anne's War in the North. So King William's War. King William's War is really 3 conflicts in one. The first of these is a long-running French-Iroquois conflict. And the Iroquois are a confederacy of 5 nations ranging in upstate New York from Albany to Lake Ontario. They had been at odds with the French since Champlain, the earliest days. And although in the 1660s, the French managed to get a peace treaty out of the Iroquois, by the late 1680s, English intrigue were pushing the 5 nations to fighting with France again. And their efforts were such that the French actually abandoned their western outposts at Niagara and Frontenac, but that wasn't enough to stop the Iroquois from launching a full-scale attack on Lachine and starting an open conflict with New France. The second of these conflicts is between New England primarily and the Wabanaki Confederacy. Now, the Wabanaki are also a confederacy of 5 nations: the Abenaki, the Malsleet, the Micmac, the Penobscot, and the Passamaquoddy. They've been at odds with New England almost from the very beginning, mostly territorial disputes. They fought against New England in King Philip's War. They also were old-time French allies from the early days of the establishment of Acadia, which is Nova Scotia. They too were having problems on the frontier, and in 1689, they launched attacks against the English. So all of these roll together when news of the War of the League of Augsburg arrives in the New World. So you have 3 wars in one. For the French, this war is dominated by the policy of petite guerre, that is the petty war, the little war of raiding and trying to keep your larger opponent on the defensive. This will be a policy that they'll follow for the rest of New France's existence. For the English, particularly New York and New England, there's an attack on Quebec and Montreal in 1690, which is the correct idea, but is very poorly executed. In fact, it fails in part because a supply ship from England is 2.5 months late. It's carrying powder. The French, on the other hand, under leadership of individuals such as Iberville, are able to seize the English posts on Hudson and James Bay. Iberville captures Fort Pemaquid in Maine, working with the Wabanaki. And then he turns his efforts against St. John's in Newfoundland, and he destroys every English town along the Avalon Peninsula, along the coast actually, but two, causing massive economic damage to English fishing fleets. So in the end, the conflict could be said to be a marginal French victory. The French were outnumbered 20-1, and they find that the petty war works. It keeps their larger opponent on the defensive. And more importantly, they're able to secure their borders and their native alliances, which they depend on for part of their defense. For New York and New England, the biggest thing was when they first organized the attack against Quebec, there seemed that there was a unity of cause between these colonies who didn't necessarily get along. But when the attack failed, each of the colonies turned to defend itself. It was impossible to do, and it allowed the French to fight them one at a time via the petty war. So a quick look, map of the area around right after King William's War, right before Queen Anne's War. In particular, you'll notice the hashed areas, the areas of conflict. For instance, up in Newfoundland, we see Placentia, which is the main French post, and St. John's, which is the main English post. But I really want to point at Acadia. That is Nova Scotia, let's say Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. This is French territory, and it's important because it guards the Gulf of the St. Lawrence. One of the other areas to speak of real quick is up in Hudson and James Bay. Now, very little will happen in Queen Anne's War up there. The French will try to attack Fort Moose, but it's badly planned. It falls apart, and essentially there's very little conflict up in the area. So the 5-year peace. Two of the biggest things that happened during the 5-year peace is, first, on the English side, the Earl of Belmont is sent over, and he'll take command of New York and New England. This addresses some of the command and control issues that were coming up in King William's War. Belmont also has a task to remove Governor Benjamin Fletcher of New York, who's basically the head of an international pirate cartel. And he tries to stop the Iroquois from negotiating a separate peace treaty with the French. He dies suddenly on March 5th, 1701. And interestingly enough, London doesn't replace his role. They send separate governors for Joseph Dudley from Massachusetts and Lord Cornbury from New York. On the French side, the Great Peace of Montreal is the biggest event that happens during this peace treaty. So Frontenac and the governor that would follow him, Collares, forced the Iroquois to sign a peace treaty with the French and over 30 of their native nation allies. The way this worked was, at the end of the King William's War, the Treaty of Ryswick, Frontenac pointed at the Iroquois and said, "We're still at war. The treaty doesn't mention you at all." And so he keeps the pressure up on the Iroquois. The English can't do anything to really help the Iroquois because they'll violate the treaty. And that pressure works. It brings the Iroquois to Montreal, and they sign a peace treaty, a neutrality treaty, that will last for almost 50 years. So news of the War of Austrian Succession would arrive in 1702. And in this conflict, you see Spain and France versus an alliance of England, which will become Britain, Austria, Prussia, the Dutch, and the Portuguese. In America, this quickly becomes known as Queen Anne's War. And it creates 3 theaters: the Northern Theater, which we'll talk about here, the Southern Theater, because Spain is an ally of France now. In the Southern Theater, you'll see South Carolina predominantly fighting with Spanish Florida and French Louisiana. You'll see an attack on St. Augustine by the Carolinians. You'll see an attack on Charleston by the Spanish and French. But probably the most important event down here is the destruction of the Spanish mission system, which completely decimates Spanish power in Florida. The other theater is out west, the establishment of the great trading center at Detroit. And there's quite a bit of English intrigue. The English are interested in upsetting the Treaty of Montreal to get the Iroquois back on their side. The French, on the other hand, are trying desperately to keep the Iroquois neutral. The English get the Ottawa to revolt out their old-time French allies, thinking that this will disrupt the treaty. But what the English are not understanding is the Iroquois really wish to remain neutral and will do so. So the war in the North. Queen Anne's War starts much differently than King William's War. King William's War starts with a bunch of knockout punches. Queen Anne's War starts with nothing. And this is primarily because Collares and Dudley, the governor of Massachusetts, are both exhausted still from King William's War. Also, they both just signed major peace treaties, the Treaty of Montreal, and in Dudley's case, they reaffirmed the Treaty of Casco with the Wabanaki. They're not interested in the conflict. They're not going to take offensive actions, and they start talking about a truce. On the New York frontier, Iroquois neutrality has completely upset the situation. The French are not interested in attacking the New York frontier for fear of bringing the Iroquois in on the English side. And without the Iroquois, the English are so weak, they don't dare do anything. So you see almost nothing on the New York frontier for the first 7 years of the war. Now, Caleres dies on May 26, 1703. He's one of the better diplomats of New France. I mean, the Great Peace Treaty of Montreal is his handiwork. He's replaced with Philip Vaudreuil, the Marquis Vaudreuil. He's more like Frontenac. He's a soldier by trade, and he kind of believes in the pen and sword approach. Now, for Vaudreuil, the biggest concern right now is the Wabanaki. If he loses the Wabanaki, we're acting as a buffer between French Acadia, which is fairly weak, and the English. There's a chance they'll lose Acadia altogether, and that will threaten the Gulf of St. Lawrence. He also has another problem, is there's no way to get at the English with the New York frontier off limits. And he really wants to get at New England because he's afraid that if he doesn't engage New England in the petty war, keeping them busy, that they'll coordinate what the French fear most, and that's an attack on Quebec and Montreal. Now, in the Wabanaki, he has ready-made partners. The English are already returning to a frontier that the Abenaki were disputing with them. And the Wabanaki are more than happy at this point to launch an attack against the English. So on August 9th, 1703, that's precisely what happens. The Wabanaki and the French attack the New England frontier, and they bring back what is reminiscent of King William's War's most dreadful decade. That is, they attack small townships, they attack crossroads, they attack farmers coming back from their fields, they attack wherever they can. One of the biggest of these raids in this conflict is on Deerfield, Mass. Here, Jean Rouville led about 50 French and 200 Abenaki, Iroquois, and Huron from the different missions around Montreal and Quebec. They moved down the Connecticut River in the middle of winter and lay outside Deerfield until about 4:30 in the morning when they couldn't see the sentry anymore. They dashed in, and within a few hours, they had taken 111 prisoners and slayed 49 settlers. That's over half the town. Now, there was a pursuit that was launched after them, but it was made clear to the pursuers that they'd start executing their captives if they didn't stop, so they stopped. This is clearly one of the biggest raids on the frontier. There'll be another one at Haverhill in 1708. But in general, the ferocity of these raids that continue through King William's War will start to diminish in Queen Anne's War. And the reasons are fairly simple. The Wabanaki have been at war for 15, 20, almost 20 years now. They're being worn down. The same is true of the French. And also, English privateers are operating in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and cutting French supplies off, which is limiting this mode of warfare. So the war in Newfoundland. The early war in Newfoundland, you can see the map here on the east side, you see all the British fishing ports and settlements. And then you see Placentia on the other side, which is the primary French fishing port. Now, these are seasonal fishing ports. Placentia, for instance, probably has about 400 people in it over the course of the winter, but it'll balloon up to 3,500 when the seasonal fishing fleets come. So both on the English side and the French side, these are very important economic instruments for them. The English will strike first. They'll have Admiral John Graydon take his fleet up from the Caribbean to attack Placentia. But Placentia is a lot like St. John's. It's almost a fjord that leads into it. And once Graydon takes a look at the seaborne defenses and realizes there's nowhere to land troops for half a dozen miles on either side, he basically calls off the attack. And this will be a trend with English attacks on Placentia. At Placentia, the governor, Daniel Subercase, and the king's lieutenant, that is the military leader there, Jacques Montagny, decide to copy Iberville's old plan in early 1705. What they'll do is they'll march overland from Placentia in the dead of winter on snowshoes, and they'll attack all these towns from the land side where they're not as well prepared. They surprise St. John's, but unfortunately for the French, Fort William, which guards St. John's, wasn't taken. They managed to take the town, however, and once they take the town, they have all the fishing vessels, and they disperse them and start burning down all the other towns on the Avalon coast. After that's complete, they try to take Fort William for a few more weeks and decide they're done, burn down St. John's, and retreat back to Placentia. So, in the spring of 1705, there's a number of prisoner exchanges that are going on between Dudley and Vaudreuil. And many of these are captives that were taken on the frontier. In Dudley's case, they're French privateers who were taken. Well, this prisoner exchange starts moving along quite well, and there's talk of a truce. And both sides are in agreement about a truce. Unfortunately, both sides create conditions where this could never really happen. And one is left with the distinct impression that both sides were taking a breather, is really what they were doing. By April of 1706, the French had seen enough of these stalled negotiations, and they began attacking the New England frontier again. The next year, the English decide that they're going to act, particularly New England. There's been fear of Port Royal, Nova Scotia for quite a while from New England. It's an excellent anchorage. It could be used by French privateers, but what's even more worrisome is if a French squadron shows up, they could operate out of here and perhaps even burn down Boston, as Iberville once proposed. So to deal with this, they launch a pair of campaigns against Port Royal in 1707. The first of these, which I've shown in the map over to the side, is probably the most controversial of them. 1,000 colonial troops show up. They land, 300 of them under Appleton, Lieutenant Colonel Appleton, land on the North Shore and move their way down. They skirmish with the French, and they finally set up an encampment across from the fort, across the Dauphin River from the fort. The bulk of the army, under Colonel John March, lands in the south, on the South Shore, marches up, has a major skirmish with Subercase, who set up redoubts on the Le Petit River, which is right in front of the fort there. This battle goes on for about 45 minutes. Subercase actually has a horse shot out from under him, and at that point he realizes that there's too many English, he'll probably be outflanked, and he retreats to the fort. That allows March to invest the fort, and it appears that the fort's days are numbered. Unfortunately, the person really in charge of this attack was a Royal Engineer by the name of John Redknapp, Captain John Redknapp. And Redknapp had chosen the place for the artillery across from the fort. It turned out to be one of the worst places he could have chosen. It was marshy ground, and more importantly, most of the fort's defenses were on the seaside, meaning that when Redknapp went over to the spot and started mapping out the positions for batteries and trenches, he was being bombarded constantly. There was also the other issue of how to even get the cannon there. The only landing site was where Appleton first landed, and you would have to drag these 2-ton metal beasts all the way over these, through forests and over streams. It became impossible. The frustration was such that Redknapp asked for a council of war, and he basically said that the fort was too strong to attack and the army too unruly to count on. In this, most of the senior officers agreed, and the campaign was abandoned. Now, when Dudley heard news of this, the fleet actually goes back to the coast of Maine, and they send a few envoys to Boston. When Dudley heard about this, he was furious, and he ordered them to launch a second attack. This one was even worse than the first. They again tried to land on the North Shore, but this time Subercase was ready. He had set up a number of French and Indian war parties, and he basically pushed them off the North Shore. The response, March, who was no longer in command, March had resigned, Wainwright was in command. So Wainwright lands on the southern shore. Here he encounters several detachments sent by Subercase. There's a brief skirmish, and then the English troops seem to have had enough. They pack up and they leave. There is a true lack of communications and skill on the English part here in this siege, but at the same time, Subercase should be commended for being aggressive in attacking the English near the beaches. Newfoundland. So here's a map of St. John's. You can see the harbor itself, and you can see the town right along the edge of the harbor. The fort that you see up above, marked B, is Fort William. Now, a little bit above and to the left of that fort is a wooden fort that would be built during Queen Anne's War. That's for the town's militia, and they would stay, detachments of them would stay in there. If you go down towards the entrance to St. John's, at South Head, you can see the stone castle. There's a battery there. And across the entrance, you can see the heights where there were several cannons set up there. And this hadn't changed significantly. This map is from 1799, but the basic defenses hadn't changed that much in that time. So one other element that made St. John's almost impossible to take from the sea was there was a wooden boom that was strung across the entrance a little farther down, and cannon on either side of it to guard the boom so no one could try to take it apart. Impossible to take from the sea, much like Placentia. Of course, the French aren't going to try to take it from the sea. So there's a new governor in Placentia, that's Philip Costebelle, and a new king's lieutenant, Joseph St. Ovid. Initially, they get there and they work on the defenses of Placentia. But in late 1708, several French privateers come into port, and some unexpected reinforcements in the form of 100 Marines show up. This gives Costebelle everything he needs to let St. Ovid enact the old plan of Iberville and attack the English settlements over on the east side. So St. Ovid puts together 100 men. They snowshoe across. And on New Year's Eve, 1708, he's outside of St. John's, about 500 yards away on the wood line. There's a sentry standing on Fort William, and he's freezing. It's about 2 a.m. It's a moonlit night. The snow is sparkling, and it's probably somewhere like -20. He blinks his eyes because suddenly he sees 100 men on snowshoes come out of the woods, and they're carrying ladders over their head. So takes the sentry a moment to adjust himself, pulls the hammer back on his musket and pulls the trigger to fire a warning shot, and it doesn't go off. So he plays with the musket some more. He reprimes it, pulls the hammer back, pulls the trigger, and it doesn't go off. Now, by this point, the militia fort, one of the sentries, is fired, and the sentry at Fort William runs to go and tell someone. The French now have got to the outer ditch, and there's a wooden stakes on the outer ditch, and they throw their ladders up against them and they climb over it. It looks like no one will challenge them at all, except there is a gunner on duty whose gun, loaded with grape shot, is pointing right at them. He had just got up there when he heard the first shot from the militia fort, and he realizes all he has to do is basically fire the cannon. He could stop the attack, except he can't find any priming powder. And by the time he realizes that it's too late, he looks out the gun port and he sees the French are in the ditch. He runs away. Now, at this point, the ladders are up against the wall. There's a score of French over the wall. A Micmac who had joined the expedition runs to the gate, opens it up, and Fort William falls in a few minutes. At this stage, St. Ovid warns the militia fort that he'll burn it down with everybody in it, and they too surrender. Suddenly, St. John's is in French hands. They repeat the old plan. They take the fishing vessels there. They attack all the settlements along the coast, except there is a little bit of a difference this time because St. John's fell so quickly. St. Ovid sends a ship to France asking the king if he wishes to keep the port. The message comes back saying the French they don't have the resources to keep the port. So St. Ovid burns everything down and returns to Placentia. Now, this is the last major action in Newfoundland. The English will threaten Placentia several times, but they'll never seriously attack it. And the outpost is never captured. As a matter of fact, it's turned over at the end of the war as part of the peace treaty. And just real quickly, if you look at the maps, if you look at one in the upper right-hand corner, you'd see what faced Graydon and some of the other English captains. You would have to sail into this narrow channel, which has heights on either side. And suddenly at the end of it, to the left, if you look down in the left-hand corner, there's a fort and a battery to the right of the fort, meaning it'd be difficult for you to turn around in your ships and you'd be caught in a crossfire from the heights in these forts. It's understandable why no one tried it. So in 1709, the Assembly of Massachusetts sends Samuel Vetch. Now, Vetch had been one of the ambassadors during the peace treaty, the truce treaty that we talked about. He'd been to Quebec several times. They sent him to England with a plan to attack New France. Now, what this plan is basically the same plan that was enacted in King William's War. That is an attack down Lake Champlain towards Montreal, while simultaneously attacking Quebec from the sea. It's the old plan that was launched in 1690 and failed. As a matter of fact, this is the plan that ultimately will succeed, just not this time. The Crown approves of the plan, and they agreed that they'll send warships and 6 regular regiments to Boston in the spring. These will merge with colonial units on station. Nicholson will command the Lake Champlain element with about 1,500 militia and a number of Iroquois volunteer. Nicholson will move to Wood Creek, and he'll wait there until he receives news that the British fleet has arrived in Boston and has departed for Quebec. So Nicholson, it's June, Nicholson is at Wood Creek, and he's still waiting for news of the fleet's arrival when Vaudreuil realizes that he also has not heard word of the British fleet, and that would give him an opportunity to assemble a force and strike at Nicholson. So what he does is he gets together 1,600 militia, places them under the command of Claude Ramezay, and orders him to sail up Lake Champlain. And the plan, if I can go back to the old map, the plan is to sail up the lake, land at Chimney Point, and then march from Chimney Point to Wood Creek, surprise Nicholson's encampment, burn his boats, scatter him, and then march back as quickly as possible because these troops might be needed for the siege of Quebec. So Ramesay heads off and he lands at Chimney Point in late August. This point is also known as Point Fear by the French because of what happens. So 1,600 men get off their boats on the shore. They march in, they marshal up, and they march into the woods. Now, landing to their right was a small detachment of Abenaki who were going to act as scouts. Some of these Abenaki mistake the French movement for possible enemy movement. There was a shot and a few war whoops, but this was quickly realized as a mistake by everybody except the main body of the army. They retreated back through the woods as fast as they could to their boats. A few of them managed to get into their boats, and one guy sent his speed record from Chimney Point to Fort Chambly. But after the officers threatened some people, they actually marshaled their ranks together. And so here they are trying to get their wits back together and marshaling back up on the beach. And all of a sudden, a few canoes appear from around the corner, English canoes. So they're ordered all back into the tree line. And a short gun battle starts occurring between 6 or 7 English canoes. They're out on a scouting expedition and the troops in the wood line. This comes to a quick end when some of the Abenaki run down to their canoes. The English just, once they see the number of muskets being fired at them, turn about, and there's a chase that goes on. They chase a few of them over to the other side of the lake at Crown Point and chase the rest down the lake. Now, they only caught 2 individuals. And when Ramesay starts speaking to these individuals, they said that there are 500 Iroquois with Nicholson at the camp. Now, this is a real problem for Ramesay. He doesn't want to start a conflict with the Iroquois. He doesn't have orders to do such. More importantly, it's clear the element of surprise is lost as some of the canoes get away. So he packs up and he goes back to Montreal. Now, Nicholson remains at Wood Creek until October. There's a British frigate that comes into Boston with news that the British fleet and troops aren't coming. They've been diverted to Portugal. This news is transferred over to Nicholson, and there's nothing for him to do but leave. They burn all the forts in the upper Hudson that they had built over the summer and abandon the campaign. So almost immediately after the end of the campaign of 1709, Nicholson and Vetch go back to London, and they're pushing for this same basic attack in 1710. Now, at the time, there's been a change of the British Secretary of State, and it's not clear whether the Brits can put together the naval and infantry forces in time to get to Boston. So in order to allow something to happen, they give Nicholson 5 warships and a regiment of Marines and tell him to attack Port Royal if the British fleet doesn't show up. Well, just as in the previous year, by the fall of 1710, it's clear that even if the British fleet does show up, it's too late to attack Quebec. So Nicholson combines his forces with the colonial forces that are waiting in Boston, and they set sail for Port Royal. This time, Subercase doesn't stand a chance. Nicholson brings a different Royal Engineer, Alexander Forbes, who actually understands his business quite well. They quickly push Subercase back into the fort. They erect 3 batteries around the fort on the land side. And on October 12th, he opens fire for a few hours. Then he stops and he sends a summons to band. Now, for Subercase, half of his garrison are militia, and they're going to retreat at the first chance they get. There's no sign that any French relief will come, and his fort's falling down around him. So he surrenders. And that is what leads to Port Royal becoming Annapolis Royal. So the following year, once again, there's a push for the old invasion plan, an attack on Quebec and Montreal. Except this time, the English actually come through. And in June, Rear Admiral Hovenden Walker, it's a strange first name, Walker arrives in Boston with 14 warships and 6 regular regiments and about 50 guns, siege guns, large siege guns. The New England and New York are caught completely off guard by this. The fleet hadn't shown up for 2 years, and nobody expected it to show up this year. So there's some delay as the colonials scramble to put together provisions for Walker's fleet. They're part of the contingency and get things in order for Nicholson so he can march to Albany and head down Lake Champlain. Now, in France, news of Walker's fleet, in New France and Quebec in particular, news of Walker's fleet also arrives, and it creates nothing but panic. Vaudreuil calls out the militia, but he only has about 3,500 men which to defend Quebec. He still has to leave some 800 or so at Montreal to protect Montreal. And more importantly, Walker's got 11 ships of the line with him. Just a few of them outgun all of Quebec. It looks pretty dismal for the French in this regard. So late July, Walker has everything in order and he sets sail for Quebec. Over 70 ships in the fleet and over 10,000 troops. Nicholson at the same time moves forward to Wood Creek. So Walker makes very good time, but he has a problem. He hasn't been able to find any pilots that have seen the St. Lawrence or have any experience on the St. Lawrence. He lands at Gaspé Peninsula, and as he's headed off to the St. Lawrence, he does capture a French captain who warns him about the river, says that the French captain has sailed the river to Quebec 40 times and he's lost 3 ships doing it, that the river can be very tricky because there are no good ports from the mouth of the river to Quebec. That is, there's no good place to pull in at night and protect yourself from the sudden squalls. And particularly in the fall, there's a wind system that sets up down the St. Lawrence that blows down the St. Lawrence. Well, Walker believes that the pilots he had was sufficient. And in late August 23rd, he's anchored in the St. Lawrence when a bad storm blows up. It actually blows the fleet towards the North Shore, and you can see the map on the right near Egg Island. And the wind is such that it runs 8 ships ashore. 7 of them are troop transports, and the others are colonial transport, and dashes them against the rocks. So Walker holds a council of war immediately after this. They're able to save almost 500 men, most of whom got to shore, but they've lost over 700 soldiers and 150 sailors. Now, there's no question that his force is still strong enough to annihilate Quebec, particularly his siege artillery hasn't been harmed at all. But the problem is there isn't a single pilot, even the French one that they had captured, who would dare take the fleet up the river at this point. Walker sees no choice, but calls off the expedition. He returns to England after a half-hearted attempt at Placentia. He, like everyone else, took a look at it and said, I'm not going to bother. And somewhat fittingly, a few days after Walker arrives at Spithead, his flagship, the Edgar, blows up at dock. And this is one of the things he'll really be court-martialed for. So these are the last days of Queen Anne's War in the North. This knockout punch, unlike King William's War, where the knockout punch came early, it comes late in Queen Anne's War and it fails. There are still some small raids that will continue until a general truce is declared in 1712. And the Treaty of Utrecht, signed in April 1713, brings an end to the conflict. Just as importantly for Governor Dudley in Massachusetts, they bring the Wabanaki to the peace table, and the Wabanaki are deeply worn down by this conflict. They bring them to the peace table and they sign the Treaty of Portsmouth in July 1713, which makes the Wabanaki English subjects. So, the conclusion. The French seriously lose at the peace table. Whereas King William's War could be called a marginal victory for the French, Queen Anne's War is a disaster. They lose Port Royal. They lose most of Acadia or Nova Scotia. It's very strange in the peace treaty. They define it as Acadia as its ancient limits, which will cause all sorts of other problems in the future. But I think this map over to the right shows the real problem. They surrender Placentia, they surrender large parts of Nova Scotia, and you can see that the Gulf of the St. Lawrence now has a lot of British flags around it. This inspires them during the peace treaty to the only directions given to the French ambassadors are make sure that you keep Cape Breton Island, because they'll erect Louisbourg there. They'll start the day the ink is dry on the treaty. This is the last stand that the French have to guard the St. Lawrence. For the Wabanaki Confederacy, another key player, this conflict's a disaster. Their numbers have been reduced to about a third of what they were at the beginning of King William's War. They were politically abandoned by the French at the end of the conflict. They're now restricted to east of the Kennebec River, and they're English subjects. The French never really could supply them like they needed to conduct the conflict, and they're on the losing end of it. For New England and New York, it's a victory. The Wabanaki have been brought to the peace table and made English subjects. Port Royal and large parts of Nova Scotia are now under English rule, although there are still French citizens that live there, and that'll cause some problems. And more importantly, While the attempts to enact the old invasion plan against Quebec and Montreal had failed, it made it clear to the French that next time it may not, and that this is probably the best approach one could take in countering the Petite Guerre, the Petty War. For the Iroquois managed to maintain their neutrality. And as I said at the beginning, they were always interested in staying neutral. They had been caught between two colonial powers for too long. They technically remained neutral. It's true. A number of Iroquois volunteer to help Nicholson, but the Iroquois make the argument to the French, nothing happened. They were there, but technically nothing happened, so we didn't violate the treaty. However, it does cause a problem. The Western Iroquois, the Seneca, start taking on a pro-French stance, and they're not interested in helping the English at all. So it does somewhat fracture the Five Nations. So after this conflict, you'll see a period of 30 years of peace. It's not always peaceful. During this, you'll see the destruction of the Wabanaki Confederacy in Dummer's War. You'll see the French run into problems in New Orleans, Natchez War. You'll see the Yamasee conflict in the South. You'll see a number of these local conflicts that are shaping how North America, the English colonies, the French and Spanish colonies, are about to enter the War of Jenkins Ear in the South. And then not long after that, another war comes from Europe, the War of Austrian Succession, which is known as King George's War. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the opportunity. And I think
Thank you, Michael. We appreciate it very much. You've obviously done your homework. And great presentation, great illustrations, and of course, great book, Queen Anne's War. We have a few questions. One is about the naval element of this war. And in your last description of the attempt to take Quebec, where they could not find a pilot to navigate the St. Lawrence River, could the English at this time, would it have been more suitable to have a naval blockade at the mouth of the St. Lawrence to starve out Quebec and prevent reinforcements from coming up the St. Lawrence and also kind of choke the life out of the garrison at Quebec?
Yeah, that's true. And that's essentially what's happening. The privateers operating in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, just the New England privateers themselves, are creating massive supply problems for the French. And yes, one could make the argument that may have been a better application, but I think those British naval elements were needed elsewhere. And that was why it took them so long to get there. What's interesting about it is when the English actually do successfully take Quebec in 1759, when the naval officers pass down the St. Lawrence, they're embarrassed. They actually say it was no worse than navigating the Thames. There is something of a legend of the St. Lawrence that's protecting it as much as the actual lack of pilots. So, yeah.
Good. Another question is, of the sites that you talk about, the villages and the seaports and on Woods Creek and at Chimney Point, are any of those sites available to be visited today as historic sites and museums? And can you tell us
Sure.
Which ones are kind of the most valuable to visit?
Yeah, Chimney Point is right across from Fort Ticonderoga, Crown Point, and Ticonderoga is nearby. Fort Chambly is still there. So in the Champlain and Hudson Valley, you can find a lot of these old forts. Ticonderoga was rebuilt in the early 1900s out of stone, and Chambly was rebuilt. They're excellent examples of fortifications that time period. I think Pemaquid is still there along the coast of Maine. There's a number of them. And of course, Fortress Louisbourg, which, although it doesn't apply to this conflict, it will apply to the next, is still there. And it's probably one of the best representatives of a fortress city from this time, what it was like to live in it and exist nearby.
Okay. Another question pertains to these several conflicts. And if I'm reading this right, I think the question is, including the French and Indian War, it seems like that Lake Champlain, Lake George, Hudson River water network running north to south was key terrain, but it seems like at the beginning of every one of these conflicts, the English were starting from scratch with a lack of roads, a lack of portages, no real fortifications. It seems like they didn't learn any lessons about French access to the frontier every single conflict. What do you think about that?
I think it's very true. So on the New York frontier, Hudson, Champlain Valleys, the English leaned on the Iroquois a lot. And when the Iroquois took a neutral stance, that put them at a disadvantage. It is true they will actually start after Queen Anne's War. You will see some fortifications built along the Hudson, but the French still beat them to the punch. They built Fort St. Frederick at Crown Point. And yes, this is a problem. The other one is the English never seem to realize that the French are not afraid to attack in the winter. As a matter of fact, they prefer to attack in the winter. And the English always seem to be unprepared for it. I mean, along those lines of those patterns, look at Newfoundland. It is the same 3 times the French used the same plan to burn down the villages in Newfoundland. And the English don't ever seem to, as you said before, learn a lesson from what happened.
We have another question similar to what you just answered, which is, I guess, summing it up, if I could, hopefully I can, is with all of these conflicts in the colonial period from the late 1600s into the 1700s and the French and Indian War, it was the British and the American colonists against the French. And the French led Indian raids, they led their own raids. How was it that American attitudes toward the French changed so easily in 1778 when the French came into the war on the part of the Revolutionary War in the part of the Americans after basically 100 years of loathing and barbarity on both sides. All of a sudden, the French are now our friends.
That's not unusual in history. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? Yep. That's really what it boils down to. And by then, the other thing is that by 1778 or so, there are generations that are around who really don't know that much about the old French and Indian Wars. America's getting larger and advancing, and those old animosities that were there for 150 years are falling to the wayside. Yeah.
Got another question about the troops. What type of colonial troops participated? Any American artillery units, or was it infantry only?
No, there was artillery raised. There's certainly at Castle William in Boston. They would keep their artillery. They would draw artillery out of there. You would see this, but what's interesting about the first 3 French and Indian Wars is there's very little English involvement. Yes, they send Walker. Yes, occasionally they send some supplies. But in general, unlike the last French and Indian War, where there's 25 British regiments and a quarter of the fleet there, in these early French and Indian conflicts, it's really citizen soldiers who are fighting this. And there is some, as a matter of fact, there was Benjamin Church, and I think you mentioned him earlier. Benjamin Church one time wanted to launch a raid on the Wabanaki, and he was down there and they were watching a demonstration in Boston Common of artillery. They were out there practicing, and one of the mortars blew up. So it is the peril of being a citizen soldier, but almost all of this are citizen soldiers, and they would practice. You would see them get together once or twice a month and practice on the commons and that.
This is a question from me because I've read King William's War and now Queen Anne's War. And what strikes me as the most unusual thing about these 2 conflicts, and I think it's going to be true of King George's War, was their ability to actually wage war on some very unforgiving geography and still be able to pull it off with logistics. And I remember the impression I got from, and correct me if I'm wrong, but on King William's War, where the campaigns up in Newfoundland all along the northern coast, the Hudson's Bay, I remember just saying, how in the world did they even supply them and move? But somehow they did it. What strikes you about the logistics of Queen Anne's War, but also colonial warfare in general?
Yeah, it's the French seem better at this than the English, and it's in part because they're leaning on techniques from Native American warfare that's going on at that time, and I think that the French have learned a lot from their native allies and how to survive in these areas and operate in these areas. But I agree with you. It's one of the more interesting things to me. The effort involved to even get there is astounding, much the less fight when you do. And I think that's why I think at King William's War, I referred to Iberville as the first Navy SEAL, because the French seem to have this ability to put together small groups with multiple talents and not be afraid of fighting in the winter, fighting on sea. And again, that's leaning a lot on their native allies where they learned that. Yeah, it is. And you'll see this even in the South. The idea that Carolina, which truly became a colony around 1680, could put together an effort to attack Fort San Carlos at St. Augustine. It's just amazing they even got there, much the less could fight. Yeah.
Sure. Michael Laramie, thank you very much, and congratulations on the new book about Queen Anne's War. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And thank you to our audience who have tuned in to hear about this, and will hopefully check out Queen Anne's War by Michael Laramie. And also want to thank our producer for this evening, Kenna Felix. And with that, we'll bid Michael and the audience a good night, and we'll see you at the next program. Thank you, everybody.